and used smoke to hide ourselves from the snipers at the front.
We now have smoke being thrown, obscuring our view.
Mortar's coming rather close.
Yeah, I can see a Q on his head.
I had a shot. I had a shot in from somewhere over there, goodness knows where.
I think that might have been Dad.
So that's me done for.
Absolutely.
Here they are. Hi, Dan. I had no idea where you were. No idea at all. But we could see you. You sure you hit me? Absolutely. I mean, it really was quite frightening because I had absolutely no idea where you guys were. It just demonstrates how a very small number of people lightly equipped can keep a serious command post in real trouble. Well, really, really quite terrifying it must have been.
You don't see them at all. They have established themselves in houses and cellars and are firing on all sides, including from our rear. Barbarians. They use gangster methods.
Soviet snipers were very effective. The German troops knew that if they broke cover, they risked being shot. German snipers were soon brought into the city as well. And as the fighting raged above the ground, the soldiers were increasingly driven down into a terrifying new arena. Troops on both sides began to fight underground. Soldiers roamed through cellars, tunnels, and even sewers like this one, as they attempted to gain an advantage over the enemy.
The German soldiers soon had a new name for this kind of fighting. They called it Rattenkrieg, War of the Rats.
It was fighting of an intensity and terror unlike anything the soldiers had experienced before.
It's hot, it's filthy, and it's stinking. And of course they knew that anywhere in the darkness, the enemy could be waiting for them.
I am alive, but in a moment I might be dead. You can get killed any second here. The fighting is very heavy, and so many people have been killed. Corpses lie on the ground, and it's dreadful to look. Our poor soldiers and Germans lie there rotting unwanted. Tanks drive over dead bodies as if they were logs of wood. The tanks are all covered in blood. It's a horror to see.
In mid-October, after over a month of fighting, buildings had been reduced to empty shells. Thousands of civilians were inside the city. Some stole food to survive, but many more died of starvation or from drinking polluted water. Alongside them in the ruins were tens of thousands of soldiers, also struggling to survive.
The fight for Stalingrad had descended into a vicious series of battles over individual buildings, sometimes with the Soviets and the Germans on different floors of the same one.
Troops could spend days trapped in a single room. In all the chaos, any sign of a clear front line simply vanished. But despite the tenacious Soviet defense, the Germans were increasing their stranglehold on the city.
The landing stage, where vital Russian supplies were brought across the river Volga, remained under heavy German fire. And fighting continued to rage for control of the city's highest point, Mamayev Kurgan. It had now changed hands several times, without either side establishing control. After 6 weeks of fighting, the German forces had managed to gain control of much of the shattered city. The Soviets only had this narrow strip of land, but somehow they were clinging on. Hitler was becoming increasingly impatient and demanded Paulus launch a decisive blow, this time on Stalingrad's industrial heart, the factories in the north of the city. They were the Soviets' last major refuge. If they lost these, they would have almost nothing left of the city. Their key stronghold was the tractor factory that dominated the entire area.
The factory had been converted to tank production to support the war effort, and despite the battle raging around it, tanks continued to roll out through its gates.
A lack of raw materials meant they couldn't actually make new tanks here, but they could repair battle-damaged ones and get them back into operation. Sometimes they were driven straight out into combat by the factory workers themselves.
But that was soon to end. On October the 14th, the attack on the factories began. Luftwaffe air raids blitzed the entire factory district. Planes flew 3,000 sorties a day, even more than in the original blitz on the city 7 weeks earlier.
Supported by 200 tanks, thousands of German infantry began to storm the factory complex. Explosions shattered these enormous windows, sending deadly shards of glass raining down on the troops below.
Even by the brutal standards of Stalingrad, it was clear that the fight for the city had reached a new level of ferocity. "8,000 Soviet commandos tried to defend the factory, but soon the walls were covered with blood. Over half of them were killed or wounded, including their commander. He was buried alive up to his neck in rubble when his command post received a direct hit. He was rescued a few hours later, but he collapsed in shock when he tried to tell General Chuikov what had happened.
With the resistance in the factories crumbling, Chuikov realized that even he would now have to retreat. The German advance through the factory district forced Chuikov to pull his headquarters back here to the bank of the Volga. He was suffering severe casualties. More than a quarter of all his men had been killed or wounded since the attacks on the factories began. Units which had come to Stalingrad with 7,000 or 8,000 men were now down to a few hundred survivors. The Soviets were once again staring defeat in the face. The unrelenting German attacks had forced Chuikov's troops back into a handful of enclaves, only 200 meters, just over 200 yards deep in some places. One up here in the north. Another toehold in the factory area. And the larger area further south. Chuikov had lost 90% of Stalingrad, but still refused to admit defeat.
The battle was well into its third month, and the heat of the summer was a distant memory. Temperatures had plummeted to well below zero. But just as it seemed that things couldn't get any worse for Chuikov's men, the river Volga started to freeze. This made it hard for boats to ferry supplies into the city. The men were cold, hungry, exhausted, and running out of ammunition.
Everyone has lost the belief that we will hold Stalingrad. No, it's clear. We will not be victorious. Our poor motherland. You have been crippled and dropped into the abyss.
Hitler was now convinced that the city was finally in his grasp. In a speech to party veterans on the 8th of November, he effectively claimed victory. But the Germans were in for a dreadful shock, because while Hitler was obsessed with the fighting in the city, Stalin's high command had been planning a bold offensive that would change the course of the whole battle. On the 19th of November, the Soviets launched one of the most awesome counterattacks in modern history. Field guns, mortars, and rockets began a ferocious bombardment 75 miles to the west of Stalingrad. It was the earth-pounding product of 2 months' secret planning. For 80 minutes, artillery thundered. Then, at 8:40 a.m., they suddenly fell silent.
Just minutes later, wave upon wave of Soviet tanks broke out from beneath their camouflage. The key phase of the Soviet battle plan was now underway. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops and thousands of tanks had been hidden in the countryside around Stalingrad, and now they were on the attack. The weather was appalling. Snow and freezing fog made it almost impossible to see where they were going. Urged on by their commanders, the troops surged forward. Infantrymen carrying their rifles ran alongside the tank, and some even hitched a ride. They clung on the back up here as the tank plunged through gullies and banks of snow. These men were leading a great Soviet comeback, thrusting deep into enemy-held territory.
Paulus got the news at his headquarters here. This is it on our map case, right here. The German front line ran from down here through Stalingrad in front of Paulus and right the way back to his rear. It was here in the north that the Soviets had mustered a massive force which had broken through behind Paulus. There was even worse news to come. Just 24 hours later, more Soviet tanks broke through the front line in the south and headed north to link up with the others. Soviet forces were closing like huge jaws around Paulus and his entire 6th Army. On the 24th of November, the jaws closed near the town of Kalach. The terrible reality dawned on Paulus. As many as 300,000 men in Stalingrad and the surrounding countryside were trapped in an area that became known as the Kessel, the German word for cauldron.
The Soviet troops were jubilant. They had outwitted and outmaneuvered the Germans. Just 5 days before, the Soviets had been on the brink of defeat in Stalingrad.
Paulus was stunned. No one had believed the Soviets had the strength to mount such a massive operation. Paulus asked Hitler permission to withdraw from Stalingrad and to punch a hole in the ring of Soviet troops surrounding him. But just like Stalin 4 months earlier, Hitler told his troops there was no question of their being allowed to withdraw from Stalingrad. Hitler ordered his